Hey everyone, welcome back to our chapter book read-along of Holes by Louis Sachar. We are now on chapter 16 of our story. And what I want you to do, as we do in all of our chapter book read-alongs, is to pause the video if you are watching this with someone, discuss some things you remember from our story, or some of your favorite parts so far, and then, here goes my quick review. Holes is about a boy named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was accused of stealing some very expensive shoes from a baseball player named Sweetfeet, who was giving them to a homeless shelter in an auction. Ugh. They literally fell from the sky and hit Stanley in the head. He had no idea. Well, we learn that Stanley, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, was given two options. He could go to jail or he could go to Camp Green Lake. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. It is neither green nor is there a lake. But the boys dig holes in what used to be the lake, and they have to dig a hole every single day out in the hot, hot sun. What we are learning is that there seems to be something the warden might be looking for, and the boys aren't just digging to build character. A few other things we have learned about Stanley is his great-great-grandfather made a deal with Madame Zeroni and broke that deal. So he is cursed, and everyone calls him his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. We also learned that Stanley's great-grandfather was robbed by someone in the Wild West of Texas named Kissin' Kate Barlow. I think we'll learn more about that story coming up. So, let's get to our story, chapter 16 of Holes. Chapter 16. As Stanley entered the rec room, he could hear X-Ray's voice from all the way across the room. "See what I'm saying?" X-Ray said. "Am I right or am I right?" The other bodies in the room were little more than bags of flesh and bones, dumped across broken chairs and couches. X-Ray was full of life, laughing and waving his arms around as he talked. "Yo, caveman, my man," he called out. Stanley made his way across the room. "Hey, slide on over, Squid," said X-Ray. "Make room for the caveman." Stanley crashed onto the couch. He had looked for a hidden camera in the shower. He hadn't seen anything, and he hoped the warden hadn't either. "What's the matter?" asked X-Ray. "You guys tired or something?" He laughed. "Hey, keep it down, will ya?" groaned Zigzag. "I'm trying to watch TV." Stanley glanced uncertainly at Zigzag, who was staring very intently at the busted television screen. The warden greeted the boys at breakfast the next morning and went with them to the holes. 4 dug in the holes and 3 tended the wheelbarrows. "Glad you're here, X-Ray," she said to him. "We need your sharp eyes." Stanley spent more time pushing the wheelbarrow than digging, because he was such a slow digger. He carted away the excess dirt and dumped it into the previously dug holes. He was careful not to dump any of it into the hole where the gold tube was actually found. He could still see the tube in his mind. It seemed so familiar, but he just couldn't place it. He thought that it might have been the lid of a fancy gold pen. KB could have been the initials of a famous author. The only famous authors he could think of were Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. Besides, it didn't really look like the top of a pen. By lunchtime, the warden was beginning to lose her patience. She made them eat quickly so they could get back to work. "If you can't get them to work any faster," she told Mr. Sir, "then you're going to have to climb down there and dig with them." After that, everyone worked faster, especially when Mr. Sir was watching them. Stanley practically ran when he pushed the wheelbarrow. Mr. Sir reminded them that they weren't Girl Scouts. They didn't quit digging until after every other group had finished. Later, as Stanley sat sprawled across an understuffed chair, he tried to think of a way to tell the warden where the tube was really found, without getting himself or X-Ray into trouble. It didn't seem possible. He even thought about sneaking out at night and digging in that hole by himself. But the last thing he wanted to do after digging all day was to dig all night, too. Besides, the shovels were locked up every night, presumably so they wouldn't be used as weapons. Mr. Pendanski entered the rec room. "Stanley," he called as he made his way to him. "His name's Caveman," said X-Ray. "Stanley," said Mr. Pendanski. "My name's Caveman," said Stanley. "Well, I have a letter here for someone named Stanley Yelnats," said Mr. Pendanski. He turned over the envelope in his hands. "Doesn't say Caveman anywhere." Thanks," Stanley said, taking it. It was from his mother. "Who's it from?" Squid asked. "Your mother?" Stanley put it in the big pocket of his pants. "Well, aren't you gonna read it to us?" asked Armpit. "Give him some space," said X-Ray. "If Caveman doesn't want to read it to us, he doesn't have to. It's probably from his girlfriend." Stanley smiled. He read it later, after the boys had gone to dinner. "Dear Stanley, it was wonderful to hear from you. Your letter made me feel like one of those other moms who could afford to send their kids to summer camp. I know it's not the same, but I'm very proud of you for trying to make the best of a bad situation. Who knows? Maybe something good will come of this. Your father thinks he's real close to breaking through on this sneaker project. I hope so. The landlord is threatening to evict us because of odor. I feel sorry for the little old lady who lived in a shoe. It must have smelled awful. Love from both of us." "What's so funny?" Zero asked. It startled him. He thought Zero had gone to dinner with the others. "Nothing. Just something my mom wrote," Stanley said. "What'd she say?" Zero asked. "Nothing." "Oh, sorry," said Zero. "Well, see, my dad is trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. So the apartment kind of smells bad because he's always cooking these old sneakers. So anyway, the letter, my mom said she felt sorry for that little old lady who lived in a shoe. Because it must have smelled bad in there." Zero stared blankly at him. "You know the nursery rhyme?" Stanley said. Zero said nothing. "You've heard the nursery rhyme about the little old lady who lived in a shoe?" "No," Zero said. Stanley was amazed. "How does it go?" asked Zero. "Didn't you ever watch Sesame Street?" asked Stanley. Zero stared blankly. Stanley headed to dinner. He would have felt pretty silly reciting nursery rhymes at Camp Green Lake. Chapter 17. For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around the area where X-Ray had supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole as well as the holes Armpit and Squid had been digging in, until the fourth day, when all three holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. "This is no bigger than when I left you yesterday," she said after arriving one morning. Well, after sunrise. "What have you been doing down there?" "Nothing," Squid said. That was the wrong thing to say. At that moment, Armpit was returning from a bathroom break. "How nice of you to join us," she said. "And what have you been doing?" I had to, go." The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backward into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 little holes in the front of his shirt, and 3 tiny spots of blood. "You're giving these boys too much water," the warden told Mr. Pendanski. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the other boys had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole, along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it up to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he passed out or not. He looked up to see Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. "I ain't digging that dirt up," he said. "That's your dirt." "Hey, Mom," Magnet called. "Caveman's been hurt." Stanley brought his fingers up to the side of his neck. He felt the wet blood and a pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out of the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of a piece of his sack of sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. "It isn't nap time." When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. "That's your dirt," Zigzag said. "You have to dig it up. It's covering up my dirt." Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up, then Zigzag dug his shovel into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been. Chapter 18. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew just how much he had to dig for the day. And it was a relief not to have other shovels swinging past his face, or the warden hanging around. He dug his shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to dump it into a pile. He had to make his turns smooth and slow. If he jerked his head too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where Zigzag's shovel had hit him. And that part of his head, between his neck and his ear, was considerably swollen. There were no mirrors in camp, but he imagined it looked like he had a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened, and his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not all that much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat into his hole. After his shower, he put his dirty clothes in the crate and got out his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write a letter so Squid and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him for writing to his mother. Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard, but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses and have to swim long distances on the lake. Tomorrow we learn. He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was nobody. To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry. Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned, felt his neck throb. I don't like when you read over my shoulder, okay? Zero said nothing. I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character. The other boys... I don't know how, said Zero. What? Said Stanley. Can you teach me? Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Teach you to what? Rock climb? Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. What? Said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. I want to learn to read and write, said Zero. Stanley let out a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero, he was just surprised. All this time he had thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. Sorry, he said. I don't know how to teach. After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to try to teach Zero to read and write. He needed to save his energy for the people who counted. You don't have to teach me how to write, said Zero, just to read. I don't have anybody to write to. Sorry, said Stanley again. His muscles and hands weren't the only parts of his body that had toughened over the past several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished his letter, barely had enough moisture in his mouth to seal the stamp and the envelope. It seemed that no matter how much water he drank, he was still always thirsty. Chapter 19. He was awakened one night by a strange noise. At first he thought it might have been some kind of animal. It frightened him. But The sleep clearing from his head, he realized that the noise was coming from the cot next to him. Squid was crying. "You okay?" Stanley whispered. Squid's head jerked around. He sniffed and caught his breath. "Yeah, I'm fine," he whispered and sniffed again. In the morning, Stanley asked Squid if he was feeling better. "What are you, my mother?" asked Squid. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. "I got allergies, okay?" Squid said. "Okay," said Stanley. "You open your mouth again, I'll break your jaw." Stanley kept his mouth shut most of the time. He didn't talk too much to any of the boys, afraid that he might say the wrong thing. They called him caveman and all that, but he couldn't forget that they were dangerous too. They were all here for a reason. As Mr. Sir would say, this wasn't a Girl Scout camp. Stanley was thankful that there was no racial problems. X-Ray, Armpit, and Zero were black. He, Squid, and Zigzag were white. Magnet was Hispanic. On the lake, they were all the same reddish-brown color, the color of dirt. He looked up from his hole to see the water truck and its trailing dust cloud. His canteen was still almost a quarter full. He quickly drank it down, then took his place in line, behind Magnet and in front of Zero. The air was thick with heat, dust, and exhaust fumes. Mr. Sir filled their canteens. The truck pulled away. Stanley was back in his hole, shovel in hand, when he heard Magnet call out, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" Magnet was standing at ground level, holding a sack of seeds. He popped a handful into his mouth, chewed, and swallowed, shells and all. "Over here," called X-Ray. The sack looked to be about half full. Magnet rolled up the top and tossed it to X-Ray. "How'd you get 'em without Mr. Sir seeing you?" asked Armpit. "I can't help it," Magnet said. He held both hands up and wiggled his fingers and laughed. "My fingers are like little magnets." The sack went from X-Ray to Armpit to Squid. "It's sure good to eat something that doesn't come from a can," said Armpit. Squid tossed the sack to Zigzag. Stanley knew it would come to him next. He didn't even want it. From the moment Magnet shouted, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" he knew there would be trouble. Mr. Sir was sure to come back, and anyway, the salted shells would only make him more thirsty. "Coming your way, caveman," said Zigzag. "Airmail and special delivery." It's unclear whether the seeds spilled before they got to Stanley or after he dropped the bag. It seemed to him that Zigzag hadn't rolled it up before throwing it, and that was the reason he didn't catch it. But it all happened very fast. One moment the sack was flying through the air. The next thing, Stanley knew the sack was in his hole and the seeds were spilled all across the dirt. "Aw, man," said Magnet. "Sorry," Stanley said as he tried to sweep the seeds back into the sack. "I don't want to eat dirt," said X-Ray. Stanley didn't know what to do. "The truck's coming!" shouted Zigzag. Stanley looked up at the approaching dust cloud and then back down at the spilled seeds. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. What else is new? He dug his shovel into his hole and tried to turn over the dirt and bury the seeds. Which he should have done, he realized later, was knock one of his dirt piles back into the hole. But the idea of putting dirt into his hole was unthinkable. "Hello, Mr. Sir," said X-Ray. "Back so soon?" "Seems like you were just here," said Armpit. "Time flies when you're having fun," said Magnet. Stanley continued to turn the dirt over in his hole. "You Girl Scouts having a good time?" asked Mr. Sir. He moved from one hole to another. He kicked a dirt pile by Magnet's hole. Then he moved towards Stanley. Stanley could see 2 seeds at the bottom of his hole. He tried to cover them up. He unearthed a corner of the sack. "Well, what do you know, caveman?" said Mr. Sir, standing over him. "Looks like you found something." Stanley didn't know what to do. "Dig it out," Mr. Sir said. "We'll take it to the warden. Maybe she'll give you the rest of the day off." "It's not anything," Stanley muttered. "Let me be the judge of that," said Mr. Sir. Stanley reached down and pulled up the empty burlap sack. He tried to hand it to Mr. Sir, but he wouldn't take it. "So tell me, caveman," said Mr. Sir, "how did my sack of sunflower seeds get in your hole?" "I stole it from your truck," Stanley said. "You did?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." "What happened to all the sunflower seeds?" "I ate them." "By yourself?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." "Hey, caveman!" shouted Armpit. "How come you didn't share with us?" "That's cold, caveman," said X-Ray. "Thought you were our friend," said Magnet. Mr. Sir looked from one boy to another, then back to Stanley. "We'll see what the warden has to say about this. Let's go." Stanley climbed up out of his hole and followed Mr. Sir to the truck. He still held the empty sack. It felt good to sit inside the truck, but out of the direct rays of the sun. Stanley was surprised he could feel good about anything at the moment, but he did. It felt good to sit down on a comfortable seat for a change, and the truck bounced along in the dirt. He was able to appreciate the air blowing through the open window onto his hot, sweaty face. Chapter 20. It felt good to walk in the shade of the 2 oak trees. Stanley wondered if this was how a condemned man felt on his way to the electric chair, appreciating all the good things in life for the last time. They had to step around holes to get to the cabin door. Stanley was surprised to see so many around the cabin. He would have expected the warden not to want campers digging so close to her home. But several holes were right up against the cabin wall. The holes were closer together here as well, and were different shapes and sizes. Mr. Sir knocked on the door. Stanley still held the empty sack. "Yes," the warden said, opening the door. "There's been a little trouble out on the lake," Mr. Sir said. "Caveman will tell you all about it." The warden stared at Mr. Sir a moment. Then her gaze turned toward Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. "Come in, I suppose," said the warden. "You're letting the cold out." It was air-conditioned inside her cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and turned it off. She sat down on a canvas chair. She was barefoot and wearing shorts. Her legs were as freckled as her face and arms. "So what is it you have to tell me?" Stanley took a deep breath to steady himself. "While Mr. Sir was filling the canteens, I snuck into the truck and stole his sack of sunflower seeds." "I see." She turned to Mr. Sir. "That's why you brought him here?" "Yes, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack and Caveman is covering up for X-Ray or somebody. It was a 20-pound sack, and he claims to have eaten it all by himself." He took the sack from Stanley and handed it to the warden. "I see," the warden said again. "The sack wasn't full," said Stanley, "and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole." "In that room, Caveman, there's a small flowered case. Will you get it for me, please?" She pointed to the door. Stanley looked at the door, then at the warden, then back at the door. He slowly walked toward it. It was a kind of dressing room, with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink he saw the case, white with pink roses. He brought it out to the warden, and she set it on the glass coffee table in front of her. She unclasped the latch and opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had one similar to it. He saw several bottles of nail polish, polish remover, and a couple of lipstick tubes, and other jars and powders. The warden held up a small jar of dark red nail polish. "You see this, Caveman?" He nodded. "This is my special nail polish. Do you see the dark, rich color? You can't buy that in a store. I have to make it myself." Stanley had no idea why she was showing it to him. He wondered why the warden would ever have the need to wear nail polish or makeup. "Do you want to know my secret ingredient?" He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. "Rattlesnake venom." With a small paintbrush, she began applying it to the nails on her left hand. "It's perfectly harmless when it's dry." She finished her left hand. She waved in the air for a few seconds, then began painting the nails on her right hand. It's only toxic when it's wet. She finished painting her nails, then stood up. She reached over and touched Stanley's face with her fingers, ran her sharp, wet nails very gently down his cheek. He felt his skin tingle. The nail of her pinky just barely touched the wound behind his ear. A sharp sting of pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned to face Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. "So you think he stole your sunflower seeds?" "No, he says he stole them, but I think it was—" She stepped toward him and struck him across the face. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanting across the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if the redness was caused by her nail polish or his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir screamed and clenched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling off the hearth and onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. "I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds." Mr. Sir moaned. "If you must know," said the warden, "I liked you better when you smoked." For a second, Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths. Then his head jerked violently, and he let out a shrill scream, worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. "I suggest you go back to your hole now." Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles on his face jump and twitch. His body writhed in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over him. "Is he— Excuse me?" Stanley was too frightened to speak. "He's not going to die," the warden said. "Unfortunately for you." And that is where we're going to end today. All right, and that was chapters 16 through 20. Let's discuss. Why did Stanley decide against digging a hole at night? So he was thinking maybe he'd go back to that hole where he actually found the gold tube, but he'd have to dig at night. Why did he decide not to? Well, one thing, he had been digging all day. He was really tired. For another, all the shovels are locked up at night. Why did Zero not get the joke about the old lady who lived in a shoe? Sadly, Zero didn't know that nursery rhyme. So there was an old lady who lived in a shoe, right? You heard that nursery rhyme? I don't know all of it. I should have looked it up. Look it up for me. Let me know what comes next in the nursery rhyme. What indications are there that the warden is growing impatient? So why does the warden look like she's getting impatient? Well, she's pacing back and forth. And at first, she was being really, really nice to the boys, wasn't she? And then slowly, as time went on, and nothing was being found, she got meaner. Explain why Stanley suddenly fell over. What happened? Well, they were all digging in one big hole, and Zigzag hit him in the back of the head with a shovel. Ow! That would hurt. Why was Stanley relieved when the boys all returned to their own holes to dig? Well, first off, he's not going to get hit in the head with a shovel again, right? Whew! And then also, were they even digging in the right place? No, they were in the wrong place in the first place. Where Stanley found the lipstick container was in a different spot. Oy. Why did Stanley not have to worry about Zero reading over his shoulder? Well, we learned that Zero doesn't know how to read or write. So he was just curious. He was watching over Stanley's shoulder because he wants to learn. How did Magnet get his nickname? Because his fingers are little magnets. He's always grabbing things and stealing them. Not good. How did Stanley get blamed for stealing from Mr. Sir? What happened? So Magnet took his sunflower seeds, right? And they were passing them around, and then Stanley dropped the bag, or it was a misthrow. Depends on who you ask, right? And Mr. Sir came back right at that moment, and he found the bag in Stanley's hole. But Stanley could have said something different, couldn't he? What did Stanley say? He took the blame, didn't he? It's very nice, especially since some of the other boys probably wouldn't have done the same. So that was really nice of him. What did you think was going to happen when he went to see the warden? What did you think was going to happen? She's not a very pleasant person, is she? But something different happened, didn't it? I thought he was going to get in big trouble. Maybe have to dig extra holes. I don't know. Well, before we talk about what actually happened, what is the secret ingredient in the warden's nail polish? It's dark red. Rattlesnake venom. Ugh. Rattlesnake venom hurts so bad, like when they bite you. Oh boy. But it's okay when it dries, but when it's wet, not good. So what did happen in the warden's cabin? She painted her nails. She kind of teased Stanley. He thought he was going to get scratched or something. And then she scratched Mr. Sir. And he was screaming in pain. It hurt so bad. Oh boy. That was a really strange place to end this. I did not think that was going to happen. She apparently was very mad at him for bringing Stanley when she thought it was something that's not important at all. Well, we will see what comes of all of that next time when we read the next few chapters of Holes by Louis Sachar. I hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll see you guys next time.